Hey guys, we're going to explore a topic that's mysterious, fascinating, and deeply profound. You might not believe it, but what's about to unfold could change the way you see a part of history and belief systems we've never truly examined. One small warning, you might not be able to see what you know the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment your location and local time below. I love saying where you're tuning in from and hearing your thoughts on this topic. Now relax and let's begin our journey of discovery together. Imagine walking into a grand, ancient temple, its walls covered in murals, every brushstroke alive with color. The air is thick with incense, and you hear chants echoing in a language you don't understand, yet feel deep in your bones. Your eyes rise to the statues at the front, tall, regal figures with skin as dark as polished obsidian, their features proud and unmistakably African. They gaze down at you with eyes carved in eternal watchfulness, a reminder that once divinity looked like this, looked like you. But here's the strange thing. If you opened a history textbook or a Bible today, you'd rarely, if ever, see these faces. It's as if someone took a paintbrush to the past and covered them over with a different image. The gods didn't vanish naturally, they were made to disappear. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. If I told you that the divine image, the very picture of God, was once celebrated in blackness across entire civilizations, would you believe me? Or has the steady drip of rewritten history convinced you that divinity could only look one way? You might feel a tension inside you right now, because this isn't just about religion, it's about power, identity, and who gets to define the face of the sacred. This vanishing act didn't happen overnight. It's the result of centuries of deliberate choice erasing the visual and cultural memory of African gods from mainstream consciousness. The strategy was subtle: replace the old images with new ones, reshape the myths, silence the oral traditions. It's like watching an artist scrape paint off a canvas only to cover it with something that serves a different master. And yet, traces remain. In the shadows of ancient temples, in the unburned pages of forgotten scrolls, in the whispered stories of elders, you still catch glimpses of the original divine faces. The truth is, history didn't lose them by accident. They were removed, overwritten, and, in many cases, demonized. But the more you dig, the more you realize that the gods of Africa weren't just local deities, they were global influencers before the word global even existed. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. If the divine was once painted in blackness, what does it mean that those images were removed? What part of humanity's story did we lose when we let that happen? Stay with me, because in the next part of our journey, we're going to step back even further to a time before the Bible's silence. There, we'll meet the gods who shaped thought, culture, and morality long before the world decided there should only be one. Before we go on, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen an image of a god that didn't match what you grew up believing? I want to know how it made you feel, because that's where awakening begins. You take a deep breath, and suddenly we're traveling back, not just centuries, but thousands of years, into an age where the world's spiritual map looked nothing like it does now. There was no single god towering over all others, no single holy book declaring itself the only source of truth. Instead, you stand in a world alive with voices, many gods, many traditions, each culture holding its own sacred stories. And in this chorus of divinity, African gods spoke loud and clear. Before the Bible's silence, the African continent was a spiritual giant. Its temples, rituals, and cosmologies weren't isolated. They were connected to a larger network of belief systems that crossed deserts, rivers, and seas. Picture the Nile flowing north, carrying not just trade goods but ideas. stories of creation, moral codes, and visions of the afterlife that influence lands far beyond Africa's borders. You'd find echoes of these same ideas later in Hebrew scriptures, in Greek philosophy, even in the earliest Christian thought. But there's something unsettling you notice the more you listen to these ancient voices. In today's mainstream religious narrative, their names are missing. The gods who once commanded whole civilizations are now either forgotten or reduced to footnotes. Imagine meeting someone who tells you a famous invention changed the world, but never mentions who actually invented it. That's how history treats these deities. What's fascinating is how early Hebrew culture didn't emerge in a vacuum. It grew alongside and in conversation with neighboring civilizations, many of them African. You have to ask yourself, if Abraham, Moses, or Joseph really did live, what spiritual environment did they walk through? What gods stood in the temples they passed by? Whose festivals filled the air with music and incense? You might be surprised at how many of those divine faces were dark-skinned, wrapped in gold, and seated on thrones that symbolized power rooted in Africa. This isn't just speculation. Archaeological digs in Nubia, Ethiopia, and ancient Sudan have revealed iconography of gods that predates the Old Testament, yet carries familiar themes: creation from chaos, divine law, deliverance from oppression. These are the very ideas we later see in biblical narratives, but the original voices are no longer credited. The erasure wasn't just about the image, it was about the source of the story itself. And here's where the silence begins to make sense. When monotheism began to solidify in the ancient Near East, it needed a clean stage. The easiest way to make one god supreme is to silence the competition, not through open war, but through quiet omission. Stop telling the old stories. Stop showing the old faces. Within a few generations, memory fades, and what was once common knowledge becomes mysterious legend at best, or pagan blasphemy at worst. Now think about what this means for you today. If your ancestors once saw themselves in the face of the divine, but that image was taken away, what happens to your spiritual confidence, to your cultural identity? This isn't just a religious question, it's a psychological one. The face of God tells people who they are, what they're worth, and where they stand in the universe. Remove that face, and you remove the mirror in which they once recognized themselves. This is why understanding what existed before the Bible's silence is so important. It's not about attacking faith, it's about completing the picture. Because if you only hear the last chapter of a story, you'll never understand the beginning, and you might misinterpret the ending entirely. So here's my challenge to you. What stories from your culture's deep past do you think have been left out of mainstream history? Drop them in the comments. This is about building a collective memory, one that refuses to let silence be the final word. From here, we'll step into one of the most vivid and undeniable examples, the living color of Egypt's black deities, where erasure becomes painfully visible. Once you see them, you'll understand why their image had to be rewritten. You open your eyes, and now you're standing in the shadow of colossal stone pillars. The air smells faintly of lotus and sand. This is Egypt. Not the Egypt of tourist brochures with tanned actors and golden costumes, but the real Egypt, alive in its ancient splendor. You walk into the temple of Karnak or Luxor, and the gods are everywhere. Their skin is carved in tones of deep brown to pure ebony, their features bold, unmistakably African. The sunlight catches the gold in their crowns, and for a moment you feel small under their gaze. These are the deities who ruled the spiritual imagination of the Nile Valley for thousands of years, gods like Osiris, the just ruler of the afterlife, Isis, the great mother and healer, Horus, the falcon-eyed sky god. In older depictions, their skin tone isn't ambiguous, it's rich, dark, and purposeful. It's not a detail you can chalk up to artistic choice. In this world, divine blackness was sacred. But if you've only ever seen Egypt through movies, museum brochures, or history books, you may have never been shown this. You've seen the gods lightened, their features softened into something less African, more palatable to a Western gaze. The transformation was so subtle that most people didn't even realize it was happening. Artists, archaeologists, and colonial historians reframed Egypt as an extension of the Mediterranean rather than an African civilization. The logic was simple. If the gods looked African, then their brilliance, power, and influence would also belong to Africa, and that was inconvenient for a world built on the myth of African inferiority. Imagine standing in front of a colossal statue of the god Amun, whose worship stretched far beyond Egypt into Nubia and Kush. His features are carved with precision, broad nose, full lips, regal posture, and yet in modern retellings, his likeness is often reinterpreted to look more European or Middle Eastern. You start to realize this isn't about historical accuracy, it's about controlling the narrative of where greatness came from. And here's something even more shocking. Egypt's priests and scribes saw their gods not just as symbolic figures, but as reflections of the people. To them, it made perfect sense that the divine would share their features, their skin, their essence. In their theology, to be made in the image of a god meant the god looked like you. That belief is a powerful anchor for cultural pride. So imagine the blow when later generations were taught that God looked nothing like them. This is why the rewriting of Egyptian imagery was more than artistic meddling, it was psychological warfare. By reshaping how people saw their gods, you reshape how they see themselves. Over centuries, even descendants of the Nile forgot that their gods once looked like them. The statues and paintings remained, but the interpretation changed. There's a phrase often whispered by modern historians. Egypt is too African for the West, but too advanced for Africa. That contradiction has fueled centuries of historical manipulation. By whitening Egypt in art, scholarship, and religion, colonial powers could claim its achievements without crediting the African civilizations that birthed them. But here's the twist. No matter how much you alter the art, the original truth leaks through. In temple reliefs untouched by restoration, in Nubian pyramids further south, in the sacred texts of the Book of the Dead, the black gods of Egypt still stand, waiting for eyes willing to see them. So I want you to pause and think. If the gods of one of the most influential civilizations in human history were black, and that fact was hidden, what else might have been erased? And more importantly, why? Leave me a comment. Tell me if you've ever seen original depictions of these gods in their true form. Did it change the way you think about history? Your answers might inspire someone else to start looking deeper. Next, we'll journey beyond the Nile to connect Egypt's black deities with other ancient powers, Sumer, Kush, and the empires whose myths were more connected than we've been led to believe. You step away from the Nile's golden banks, crossing landscapes that shift from lush river valleys to wide deserts, and then to fertile plains far beyond the horizon. As you move, the familiar faces of Egypt's black gods seem to travel with you, appearing in carvings, myths, and symbols far from their homeland. This is where you realize something stunning. Africa's divine imagery wasn't contained by geography. It flowed outward, touching and shaping civilizations you might never have thought were connected. To the south, you reach Kush and Nubia, where the temples feel like echoes of Egypt, but with their own proud identity. Here, the god Amun is still worshipped, but he takes on new titles, deeper skin tones, and a more warrior-like presence. Kushite kings not only saw themselves as the heirs to Egypt's legacy, they conquered Egypt at times, ruling as its 25th dynasty. These rulers didn't erase the black gods, they elevated them, building monuments where divine blackness was front and center. Then you turn eastward, following ancient trade routes that cut across the Red Sea. Here you find Sumer and Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. At first glance, the gods here seem different. Enki, the god of wisdom, Inanna, the queen of heaven, Utu, the sun god. But as you listen to their stories, you start hearing familiar notes: flood myths, divine judgment, sacred laws handed down by celestial figures. You realize these are variations on themes you've already encountered in African traditions. And the more you look, the more the similarities jump out, not just in story, but in appearance. Some early depictions of Mesopotamian deities show features that modern interpretations tend to smooth out, just as they did with Egypt. It's not hard to imagine that migration, intermarriage, and trade carried African influence northward, leaving its mark on the gods themselves. Even linguistics tells a story here. Certain divine names and concepts in early Mesopotamian and Semitic languages share roots with words from African tongues. These aren't coincidences. They're the fingerprints of cultural exchange. When priests, merchants, and travelers met, they swapped more than goods. They swapped gods, merging attributes and stories until they became difficult to separate. But somewhere along the line, the flow of influence began to be written in only one direction: civilization coming from the Near East into Africa, rather than the other way around. That's the narrative you probably grew up with. But standing here, seeing the patterns with your own eyes, you know that's not the full truth. The connections between Egypt, Kush, and Sumer matter because they reveal a spiritual network where black divinity was not foreign, it was foundational. These weren't primitive gods being replaced by more refined ones. They were part of a shared human story that stretched across continents. Yet by the time later monotheistic religions rose to dominance, the African threads in that tapestry had been carefully pulled out. And here's the hard question you have to ask. If ancient civilizations were this interconnected, why does our modern understanding of them insist on separation? Why are African contributions treated as isolated side notes instead of integral chapters? The answer lies in what we're about to explore next: how the rewriting began, and why the image of black gods had to be deliberately removed from sacred narratives. Before we move on, tell me in the comments which ancient civilization fascinates you the most: Egypt, Kush, Sumer, or another entirely? I'm curious which world you'd want us to explore in more depth. Because next, you'll see exactly how the erasure happened, not by destroying temples outright, but by reshaping what people saw and remembered until the original divine faces became ghosts. You're standing in a dimly lit chamber. In front of you is an ancient scroll, its edges frayed, its ink faded, but you can still make out the shapes of figures drawn in careful strokes. At first, you see familiar dark faces, intricate hairstyles, and richly patterned garments. But then your eyes drift to the next panel, and the faces look different. The features are narrower, the skin tone lighter, the clothing altered. You've just witnessed the first stage of the rewriting. The rewriting didn't come with an announcement. No scribe stood up and declared, "We're changing history." It crept in quietly through artistic updates, new translations, and theological reinterpretations. Over time, black deities in African and Near Eastern art were either lightened, stripped of distinct features, or replaced entirely. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a natural evolution of style. But once you know the truth, you see the intention behind every brushstroke. This was about more than art. It was about control. In a world where religion was the ultimate authority, whoever controlled the image of God controlled the people. And if the face of God resembled you, it affirmed your place in the divine order. But if that face was replaced with one that looked nothing like you, it suddenly told you that the sacred belonged to someone else, that you were a subject, not an heir. The methods varied. Some were visual, altering temple murals during restorations, reinterpreting statues in museum displays, creating new iconography that aligned with the emerging political and racial hierarchies of the time. Others were textual. In translations of sacred writings, names of African gods were omitted or recast as villains, while their roles were attributed to new figures. Even oral traditions, which had resisted written manipulation for centuries, began to shift as outside powers imposed their own versions of the stories. One of the most insidious techniques was syncretism, the blending of old gods into the image of new gods. At first glance, it might seem like respect, a merging of traditions, but in reality, it acted like a smokescreen. The older, darker faces were hidden beneath new titles, eventually forgotten by name. Worshippers would pray to the new god without realizing they were invoking an older, African deity whose image had been deliberately altered. This erasure wasn't random. It aligned perfectly with the rise of empires and the spread of monotheistic faiths. As political power consolidated, so too did spiritual authority. Many gods meant many centers of influence, and that was inconvenient for rulers who wanted unity under their control. Rewriting the divine image was the ultimate power play. You might wonder, why not simply ban the old gods outright? The answer is simple. Outright bans provoke resistance, but gradual erasure, that works quietly, reshaping memory without a fight. After a few generations, the people don't even know there's something to resist. And yet, the rewriting never completely succeeded. In remote villages, in underground rituals, in the carved amulets worn close to the skin, the older images survived. They were whispered about, guarded like family treasures, waiting for a time when they could be openly seen again. So I want to ask you, if you discovered that the divine image you've always known was a replacement, would you feel betrayed? Would you want to see the original face, even if it challenged everything you've been taught? Leave your answer in the comments because your reaction might be the same one ancient people felt as their gods slowly disappeared from view. Next, we'll see the moment when the shift from many gods to one god became official, a transformation that didn't just reshape religion, but rewired how entire civilizations saw the divine. You're standing in a vast courtyard under a blazing sun. Around you, once separate shrines and temples have been stripped of their individual banners and colors. Where there were once many altars for many gods, there is now only one. The faces that once gazed down from carved reliefs are gone, replaced by the singular, commanding image of one deity, one name, one law, one truth. This is the moment when the shift from many gods to one god stops being gradual and becomes official. It's no longer an unspoken drift, it's a deliberate declaration. You can almost hear the voice of a king or high priest announcing that the era of many divine faces is over, and from this day forward, only one is to be worshipped. On the surface, it sounds like unity, a noble call to bring people together under a single banner. But you've been watching closely, and you know what's really happening. Monotheism doesn't just elevate one god, it erases all the others. And in this process, it's the African gods who are most at risk of vanishing, because their imagery and stories don't fit the emerging political narrative. Imagine being a priest in Nubia or Kush during this transition. Your god, once worshipped for centuries, is suddenly labeled a false idol. The festivals you've celebrated since childhood are outlawed. Your sacred images are destroyed or stored away in hidden chambers. If you resist, you're branded as an enemy of truth, or worse, a danger to society. And here's the deeper layer. When many gods exist, power is decentralized. A fisherman might pray to a river goddess, a farmer to a fertility god, a warrior to a deity of battle. Spiritual authority is spread across multiple figures and, by extension, across multiple communities. But with one God, all worship and all power flows upward to a central authority, often controlled by the state or a single religious elite. The move from many to one wasn't just a theological decision, it was a political strategy. It allowed rulers to control religious interpretation, law, and morality from the top down. The new god's image was shaped to reflect the ideals and ethnicity of those in power, making it easier to justify their dominance. In this framework, black divinity became politically inconvenient, an image that didn't serve the central narrative. It's here that you start to understand why this erasure feels so intentional. If the divine could only be imagined one way, then every other image became not just unnecessary, but dangerous. The African gods, with their proud features and deep histories, didn't just represent a different theology, they represented a different claim to power, one rooted in Africa's authority as a cradle of civilization. And so, temples were rededicated, myths were rewritten, sacred symbols were reinterpreted. The old gods weren't just set aside, they were systematically reframed as unworthy, even demonic. And this was the first step towards centuries of religious bias that would shape how people saw Africa and its role in the world's spiritual story. But here's the thing, truth has a stubborn way of surviving. Even as the singular god rose to dominance, fragments of the old beliefs stayed embedded in culture, hidden in songs, preserved in rituals, or disguised under new names. The transition was never complete, no matter how hard the ruling powers tried. So let me ask you, if you lived during this shift, would you go along with the new order, or would you risk everything to keep your god's image alive? Comment your answer below, because the choice between survival and truth is one every culture has faced at some point. Next, we'll go even deeper into how this new centralized image of God was weaponized, not just to unify faith, but to reshape identity and rewrite the story of who belonged at the center of the divine narrative. You find yourself in a grand hall, where the air is thick with the scent of incense and the hum of political tension. At the far end, seated on a raised platform, is not a god, but a ruler, draped in ceremonial robes, wearing a crown that catches the light. In his hand, a staff, topped with the sacred symbol of the one God. You realize something unsettling. The divine image has now become a political tool. The politics of the holy image isn't new, but in this new age of one God, it's more potent than ever. Whoever controls how God is portrayed controls not only religion, but the collective identity of the people. And so, the image is shaped to serve a purpose, to reflect the ethnicity, values, and authority of those in power. In this scheme, gods with African features are not just omitted, they're a threat to the legitimacy of the ruling class. Imagine you were a citizen living under this new system. Every mural, every coin, every sacred text now shows the same face, one that doesn't look like you. The message is subtle but relentless. The sacred does not resemble you, therefore you are not sacred. Your heritage, once intertwined with the divine, is now framed as a relic of a misguided past. This shift is not accidental. Political and religious leaders understand the power of symbols. The human mind is wired to draw meaning from what it sees. And if every representation of God reflects the ruling elite, it cements the idea that power and divinity are inseparable, and both belong to the same group. This is why African gods, with their undeniable connection to a different heritage, had to be rewritten or erased. In some cases, the rulers didn't even need to destroy the older images outright. Instead, they controlled access to them. Statues were locked away in temple storerooms, ancient texts restricted to a priestly class loyal to the new order. When the public no longer saw the old gods, they slowly disappeared from memory. But here's the fascinating part. In remote areas far from the political centers, communities continued to keep their gods alive. They might not have been able to display the statues openly, but they preserved the imagery in embroidery, pottery, and jewelry. Some even hid their deities in plain sight, incorporating them into the new religious art under altered names and symbols. This quiet resistance meant that while the official image of God was tightly controlled, the undercurrent of African divinity never fully died out. The use of God's image as a political tool didn't just erase heritage, it also justified expansion and conquest. If your god looked like the ruler's god, you were in the fold. If not, you were a heathen, a pagan, someone in need of saving or subjugating. The erasure of African gods was therefore not just a theological act, but a license for colonization, slavery, and cultural domination centuries later. And here's where you start to feel the weight of it. This isn't ancient history frozen in dusty books. The manipulation of God's image still shapes the modern world, in the paintings that hang in churches, in the faces printed in religious children's books, in the films that define sacred stories for new generations. So I want you to think about this. When was the first time you saw a depiction of God, angels, or prophets? Did it look anything like the place or people those stories actually came from? Drop your answer in the comments, because this simple question can reveal just how deep the influence of this image control runs. Next, we'll walk into the silent pages of Scripture themselves, those carefully chosen words that hint at what's missing, where the absences speak louder than the text. That's where the erasure becomes not just visual, but written into the very fabric of belief. You're sitting in a quiet room, a sacred text open in front of you. The candlelight flickers over the thin pages, and your eyes move slowly across the words. You expect to find the world's full spiritual history here, the voices of every people who shaped the story of God. But as you read, you notice something strange. Some names you've heard whispered in oral traditions aren't here. Certain lands, once vibrant centers of faith, are barely mentioned. Entire lineages seem to vanish between chapters. This is the Bible's silence. The silence is not empty. It's selective. When African civilizations appear, they often do so briefly, in passing, as though they were mere footnotes in a grander story. Yet archaeology, anthropology, and the cultural memory of those same African peoples tell you they were anything but footnotes. They were central characters in the earliest chapters of human spirituality. But on these pages, their presence is faint, their gods absent entirely. Imagine for a moment that you're an ancient scribe compiling the sacred record. You have before you countless oral histories, scrolls, and accounts from neighboring cultures, including Africa. But you're working under the authority of a religious elite with a clear agenda to promote one God, one lineage, one chosen people as the central thread. What do you do with all the stories that don't fit neatly into that design? You leave them out. You soften them. You recast them so their original context is lost. And here's the thing. Erasure in Scripture isn't always about removing names. It's about changing the role those names play. A powerful African queen becomes a mysterious visitor. A deity worshipped for centuries becomes an idol condemned by the prophets. An empire that influenced trade, politics, and belief is reduced to a brief mention in a list of conquered lands. When you compare the text to what's known from archaeology, the absences become glaring.
The kingdom of Kush, with its vast wealth and influence, barely appears in biblical accounts, yet it ruled Egypt and interacted with Israel directly. Ethiopia, with its deep and ancient Christian tradition, is mentioned only sparingly, often in metaphor. The gods of Nubia, Egypt, and other African civilizations, nowhere to be found by their true names. The result is a spiritual narrative that feels complete until you realize entire threads have been pulled out of the weave. This silence doesn't just distort history, it shapes the way generations see themselves in relation to the divine. If the text you grow up reading never shows people like you standing beside God, leading nations, or embodying the sacred, you might start to believe you never did. And that's the power of omission. It doesn't tell you what to think outright, it simply shapes what you never think to question. But silence can't hold forever. Fragments of the erased stories survived in apocryphal writings, in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, in oral traditions kept alive by griots and elders. In these, the African presence is undeniable. Powerful rulers, wise prophets, and gods who shaped the spiritual imagination of their people. So let me ask you, have you ever read a sacred text and felt like something was missing, even if you couldn't name it? That feeling, that nagging awareness, might be your mind picking up on the gaps. Share your thoughts below. Your insight might help someone else start asking new questions. Because in the next step of our journey, you'll see what happens when the old gods aren't just erased, they're vilified. This is the stage where black divinity is recast not as sacred, but dangerous, even evil. And that shift has consequences that still echo today.
The temple is gone. In its place stands a new altar, built on the same foundation stones, but bearing none of the old symbols. You hear the chants of a congregation, but the words are different now. Harsh toward the past, warning against the worship of false gods and idols. The faces that once looked down on their people with pride and protection are now whispered about as evil spirits, dangerous deceivers. This is how the demonization begins. It's not enough to erase the memory of the black gods. To secure the new order, those gods must be feared. Reverence must be replaced with revulsion. And so in sermons, scrolls, and sacred law, their names become curses. In the retelling, a god who once symbolized fertility becomes a demon of lust. A goddess of wisdom becomes a witch to be condemned. A divine protector becomes a monstrous oppressor to be cast down. You see this pattern again and again in the shift from polytheism to monotheism. The conqueror doesn't just take away your gods, they take them into their own system and redefine them in a way that turns you against your own heritage. It's one of the most effective psychological strategies of control. Make you distrust the symbols of your own culture. And here's the cruel irony. Sometimes the new religion keeps parts of the old gods, but hides them under different names. A black mother goddess may be reimagined as a saint or an angel, stripped of her original identity, but still quietly carrying her ancient attributes. The worship continues in disguise, even as the official narrative denounces it. This demonization wasn't limited to Africa. It happened in Europe, Asia, and the Americas too. But the portrayal of African gods as demonic carried an extra layer of racialized fear, an idea that would be weaponized centuries later during colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. If African spirituality could be painted as inherently dark and dangerous, then suppressing it became righteous work in the eyes of the oppressors. Think about the long-term effect of this. Generations grow up hearing that their ancestral gods are evil. They're taught to fear the stories their grandparents once told with pride.
And over time, the fear becomes so ingrained that even without outside pressure, the community polices itself, rejecting its own heritage to prove its loyalty to the dominant faith. Yet here, resistance survived. In hidden ceremonies, in coded songs, in symbols carved into wood and stone, the old gods found ways to live on. They became tricksters, saints, or nameless spirits, still guiding their people in ways the new rulers couldn't quite stamp out. So here's my question for you. If you learned that a figure you've always been taught to fear was originally a god of your ancestors, would you reclaim them? Or has the fear been woven in too tightly to untangle? Your answer might reveal more than you think. Next, we'll look at the strange afterlife of these gods, how even after demonization, echoes of them survived in myths, legends, and even the religions that replaced them.
You're sitting by a fire under a night sky, listening to an elder tell a story. At first, it sounds familiar. A tale you might have heard in a different setting, perhaps in a church, a mosque, or a folktale collection. But as the details unfold, something clicks in your mind. This isn't the version you know. Beneath the new names and altered plot, you can feel the heartbeat of an older story, the echo of a god erased from the official record, but still alive in disguise. This is how the black gods survived after their erasure and demonization, not in their original temples, but hidden inside other myths and legends. The transformation was subtle. A river goddess became a saint who blessed water. A warrior deity became an archangel who fought evil. A fertility god became a nameless guardian spirit in village tales. Stripped of their African names, they moved like ghosts through the new religions, unrecognized by most, but still performing their ancient roles. You see it in European folklore, where mysterious Moorish figures appear in medieval tales, often as wise strangers, healers, or protectors of sacred treasures. You see it in Islamic traditions, where certain African saints are revered for powers and attributes that mirror pre-Islamic deities. You even see it in Christianity, where black Madonnas, dark-skinned depictions of the Virgin Mary, bear uncanny similarities to ancient African mother goddesses. It's almost as if the gods found ways to trick the systems that tried to erase them. By adapting their appearance and changing their names, they could hide in plain sight, continuing to influence human life without drawing the wrath of those who would destroy them. But this survival came at a cost. Over time, the true origins of these figures were forgotten by most people. The connection to Africa faded from memory, replaced by a sanitized, acceptable version that fit the dominant culture's narrative. The old power was still there, but the rightful heritage had been severed. And yet, if you know how to look, you can trace the threads back. The attributes, the symbols, the rituals, they point to a shared root. A certain way of holding the hands in prayer, a specific color of cloth used in offerings, a dance performed in celebration. These are the fingerprints of the old gods still marking the present. This is why reclaiming the truth matters. It's not just about giving credit where it's due, it's about restoring the spiritual lineage that has been hidden for centuries. Every time you recognize an echo of an African god in a modern story, you're peeling back the layers of erasure. You're seeing the continuity that others tried to break. So, I want to know, have you ever noticed a tradition, a holiday, or a ritual in your faith that seemed oddly out of place, as if it came from somewhere older? Share it in the comments. These small clues, when brought together, can form a map leading back to the original sources. Because next, we'll put our hands in the soil of history, digging into the archaeology of memory, where artifacts and oral traditions refuse to let these gods vanish completely. The past is not as buried as it seems. You're kneeling in the dust, brushing sand away from something buried for centuries.
Slowly the shape emerges, a fragment of carved stone, smooth in some places, worn in others. It's the face of a god. The features are unmistakable, dark, proud, and powerful. You're staring at proof that the divine once looked like this, despite everything history tried to hide. This is the archaeology of memory. Unlike rewritten texts or altered paintings, artifacts don't lie easily. They are stubborn witnesses, carrying the truth in their stone, clay, and metal. In Nubia, archaeologists have uncovered statues of Amun with deep African features, untouched by later restoration efforts. In ancient Sudan, wall paintings show queens and gods in rich, ebony tones, wearing crowns that rival any European monarchs. And in Ethiopia, relics of pre-Christian and early Christian worship reveal a spiritual tradition deeply rooted in African identity, yet eerily absent from mainstream narratives. But archaeology isn't just about what's dug up from the ground, it's also about what lives on in the mind. Oral traditions, passed from elder to child, often preserve details no artifact can show. A grandmother might tell a story about a river spirit who brings fertility to the land. A village might perform a dance every spring that traces back thousands of years to a god now absent from any official record. These stories are living artifacts, carrying memory across time without the need for ink or stone. Even language can be an artifact. Words used in sacred songs today might carry syllables from ancient African languages, surviving like fossils hidden in plain speech. A prayer might invoke a god's ancient attribute without ever saying the name. Yet to those who know, the connection is clear. The beauty and power of these findings is that they dismantle the myth of complete erasure. The gods were never fully destroyed. They were buried, scattered, disguised, but not gone. Each artifact, each story, each symbol is a piece of the puzzle, waiting to be recognized and placed back into the larger picture of humanity's spiritual history. And here's where it gets personal. When you stand before one of these artifacts and see the divine wearing the features of your own heritage, something shifts inside you. It's more than pride, it's a reclaiming of a truth that was stolen. You realize that history isn't just something you learn, it's something you can restore. So here's my question to you. If you had the chance to hold one of these artifacts in your hands, to feel the weight of history pressing into your skin, what would you do with it? Would you hide it, protect it, or display it for the world to see? Comment your answer, because your choice says a lot about how you see the future of this truth. Next, we'll witness the moment when these buried gods start to rise again, not in temples, but in the hearts and actions of people determined to awaken what was forgotten. You're standing in a crowded marketplace, but this isn't an ordinary day. The air is electric. People are gathering, singing, drumming, wearing colors you've only seen in old paintings and museum displays. At the center, an elder raises a carved wooden figure high above their head. The crowd erupts in a chant that hasn't been heard in public for generations. In this moment, you realize the forgotten gods are waking. This is the awakening of the forgotten. It doesn't start in a palace or a cathedral. It begins quietly, in the margins. A small group gathers to study oral histories. A musician weaves ancient rhythms into modern songs. An artist paints deities with features that match the people in their own community. At first, it's a personal act of reclamation, but slowly the movement grows. People begin to question the sanitized histories they were taught. They begin searching for the names, faces, and stories erased from their sacred books and cultural memory. In Africa, the diaspora plays a powerful role in this revival. Descendants of enslaved peoples scattered across the globe trace their roots back to traditions that were violently suppressed. From the Caribbean to Brazil, from the United States to Europe, they bring back fragments of their spiritual heritage: Yoruba orishas, Congo spirits, Egyptian deities, linking them together in a living network of rediscovery. And it's not just religious. The awakening is cultural, psychological, and political. To reclaim the image of a black god is to reclaim self-worth. It's to say, my history did not begin in chains. My divinity was never a gift from someone else's god, it was mine from the start. That's a dangerous idea for any system built on the lie of inferiority. Resistance comes, of course. Institutions that have benefited from centuries of erasure push back. Some dismiss the revival as superstition. Others attack it outright, labeling it blasphemy or heresy. But those who've tasted the power of remembering cannot be silenced. The more they learn, the more they teach. The more they speak, the more others listen. And here's the most beautiful part. The awakening doesn't require destroying the present to honor the past. Many find ways to blend their current faith with the restored image of their ancestors' gods, creating something both ancient and new. It's not about replacing belief, it's about completing it. The gods themselves seem to return in synchronicity, old symbols reappearing in dreams, ancient chants surfacing in moments of crisis, sacred animals crossing paths at just the right time. Whether you see it as coincidence or divine intervention, the effect is the same. The past is alive and it's calling. So tell me, if you heard that call, would you answer it? Would you risk the discomfort of challenging everything you've been taught for the sake of a truth your ancestors carried in their bones? Drop your answer below, because the next step is seeing what happens when that truth isn't just remembered privately, but reflected boldly in the image of God itself. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore what it means to restore the divine mirror and how seeing yourself in the face of the sacred can transform everything you believe about who you are. You're standing before a mirror, but it's not glass. It's polished obsidian, dark and gleaming. As you lean in, your reflection shimmers, and for a moment, it's not just you staring back. The features in the mirror shift and merge with those of the old gods: broad nose, full lips, deep brown skin, eyes that hold the weight of centuries. You're seeing the divine as your ancestors once did, in their own image. This is the restoration of the divine mirror. For thousands of years, that mirror was shattered. The pieces were scattered across continents, buried under rewritten histories and distorted images. Generations grew up looking into mirrors that reflected someone else's face in place of their own. And here's the thing. When you can't see yourself in the image of the sacred, it's not just a loss of representation. It's a theft of identity, dignity, and belonging. Restoring the divine mirror is about putting those pieces back together, even if the cracks still show. It's about undoing the conditioning that made people believe God could only look one way. When the divine reflects your features, it tells you something radical. You were never an outsider in the sacred story. You are always at its center. Artists are among the first to lead this restoration. Paintings, sculptures, and digital creations now depict biblical prophets, saints, and even Christ with African features, returning them to the geographic and cultural reality of their origins. Scholars publish research that connects ancient African spiritual traditions to foundational stories in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Communities revive rituals that honor ancestral deities alongside newer faith practices, refusing to choose between them. The effect on individuals is profound. A child who sees themselves in the sacred learns that their skin is not a barrier to holiness, but a reflection of it. An elder, after decades of worshiping a god who looked nothing like them, finds tears streaming down their face the first time they see the Black Madonna or an African Moses. These are not just emotional reactions, they are awakenings, moments when the soul reclaims what was stolen. But restoring the divine mirror also challenges power structures. If everyone can see themselves as divine, then no one can claim exclusive ownership of God. It breaks down the hierarchies built on the idea that some are closer to the sacred than others. That's why this restoration is often met with resistance, not because it's false, but because it's too true. And yet, truth has momentum. The more people see the restored image, the harder it is to forget. Once you've looked into the mirror and seen yourself as sacred, you can't go back to believing you're merely tolerated in the divine story. You know you belong there. So I want you to ask yourself, if you could redesign the image of the divine to reflect the true diversity of humanity, what would it look like? Would you keep the features of one group, or would you let them all shine through? Leave your answer below, because in the next part of our journey, we'll see what happens when truth like this doesn't just survive, but actively resists the forces that try to bury it again. You're standing in the middle of a storm, not of rain or wind, but of words, images, and ideas. Around you, voices clash. Some shout that the restoration of African divinity is blasphemy. Others cry out that it is justice long overdue. And in that chaos, you realize something. Truth doesn't simply return quietly. When it comes back, it resists being buried again. This is the resistance of truth. For centuries, systems of power relied on keeping certain histories hidden. They counted on silence, on compliance, on people accepting the official version without question. But once enough people start asking what really happened, the silence cracks. One artifact in a museum, one rediscovered manuscript, one photograph of an untouched temple wall. These can ignite conversations that refuse to die down. And here's the fascinating thing about truth. It spreads faster when it's challenged. Every time an institution tries to dismiss evidence of Black divinity as irrelevant or misinterpreted, it draws more attention to it. Every time someone tries to ridicule the idea, they force others to ask why it provokes such a strong reaction. Resistance, ironically, can amplify the very thing it seeks to suppress. This resistance takes many forms. In academia, scholars fight for African civilizations to be studied with the same rigor and respect given to Europe and Asia. In art, creators reclaim sacred imagery, pushing it into public spaces where it can't be ignored. In faith communities, leaders begin reintroducing African saints, prophets, and historical figures into their teachings. But the most powerful resistance comes from everyday people, those who refuse to let their heritage be reduced to a shadow. They teach their children the stories their grandparents told them. They wear symbols of their gods openly. They celebrate festivals long thought lost right in the streets, and with every act of remembrance, they chip away at the erasure. The pushback is fierce. Laws, censorship, and public campaigns try to frame this reclamation as divisive or dangerous. Yet the movement grows because it's not based on propaganda. It's based on evidence, memory, and lived experience. You can erase a picture from a book, but you can't erase the feeling someone gets when they stand before a statue that looks like them and realize it's been there for thousands of years. This is why the resistance of truth feels unstoppable. It's not just academic or cultural, it's spiritual. It taps into something older and deeper than any empire or institution. The same forces that tried to bury the gods are still at work. But now they're facing a generation that refuses to bow to their version of history. And here's the question for you. When you hear the truth, do you stand with it, even if it makes you uncomfortable? Or do you turn away, pretending you never saw it? Your answer might determine whether the truth keeps moving forward or gets buried again for another century. Because in the final part of our journey, we'll witness the return, not just in memory or resistance, but in a living, breathing cultural and spiritual restoration that brings the black gods back to their rightful place. You're standing on a hilltop at dawn. The horizon is painted in gold and deep crimson, the air alive with the low hum of drums and voices rising together. Below you, a gathering stretches farther than you can see. People dressed in colors of earth and sky, holding banners painted with faces once thought lost. Statues of the old gods stand side by side with symbols from modern faiths, not in competition, but in harmony. The return has begun. This is the return of the black gods. It's not a return to the past exactly, it's something new. The old names are spoken again, the old songs sung, but they're infused with the experience of centuries. People who once had to hide their beliefs now walk openly, honoring the divine in forms that reflect their own faces. They don't see it as abandoning their current religions, but as restoring the missing chapters, making their faith whole. You notice that this restoration isn't about rebuilding the exact temples of old, it's about carrying the spirit of those temples into today. A mural on the side of a building in Lagos shows Isis cradling a child. A poetry reading in Harlem invokes Amun and Osiris as metaphors for strength and rebirth. In Brazil, a procession blends Catholic saints with Yoruba orishas, unapologetically honoring both. And here's what's most striking. No one here is waiting for permission to reclaim this heritage. The return is happening because people decided it must. Museums can keep their locked storage rooms. Institutions can cling to their altered narratives. But the truth is out in the open now, and it moves through art, music, scholarship, and community with a momentum that no single authority can stop. The psychological impact is just as powerful as the spiritual. For centuries, people were told, directly or indirectly, that the sacred could not look like them. Now, they look into the face of the divine and see their own reflection. This changes how they walk in the world. It changes how they teach their children. It changes how they dream. And as the sun climbs higher, you realize something profound. The return of the black gods isn't only about Africa. It's about everyone reclaiming the right to see themselves in the divine. It's about a world where God is not a single face, but every face. Where no culture is erased, no history dismissed, no truth silenced. So tell me, now that you've walked this journey, what will you do with what you've seen? Will you keep it to yourself, or will you share it so that others might remember too? Drop your answer in the comments, because the return isn't just happening in temples and streets, it's happening in every conversation where someone chooses to speak the truth. The sun is fully risen now, the crowd's voices echoing into the day. The gods have returned, not as relics, but as living presences in the minds and hearts of their people. And you, standing here, are part of that return. So, are you ready to keep exploring this journey? If what we uncovered tonight made you rethink everything you thought you knew about history and religion, don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Drop a comment below, let me know what you think about this buried truth. And don't forget to hit like so this message reaches others searching for answers too. We've only just scratched the surface. There are still gods whose names we haven't spoken, temples we haven't visited, and connections between cultures that remain hidden in plain sight. This story isn't over. It's being written right now in the choices we make about what to remember and what to forget. If you've felt that spark of recognition, the sense that something deep within you has been waiting to hear these truths, then follow it. Read more. Ask questions. Talk to elders. Visit the places where the old gods still stand. And most importantly, share what you find. The more we speak these stories, the harder it becomes for anyone to erase them again. Make sure you're subscribed and that the notification bell is on, because the next chapter we explore might just connect pieces of your own heritage you didn't even know were missing. Whether you're from Africa, the diaspora, or anywhere else, the truth of the Black Gods matters, because it's not just African history, it's human history. And maybe, just maybe, as we keep uncovering these layers, we'll build a world where no face of the divine is ever forgotten again.